One of the great challenges of being a parent, or a grandparent for that matter, is that we tend to learn from experience, and by the time we're done learning from experience, the damage is done. Usually parents blame themselves too much for the damage. Kids certainly blame parents too much for the damage, if you will, but it's tough to be a parent. Fortunately for us, we have from our Torah, we have many lessons in parenting. One of the most famous questions is, why does the Torah bother with the entire book of Genesis? Why don't you just start with the laws and tell me what to do? And one of the reasons for that is to help us understand our history, the context of our history. But one of the things that we get out of these early stories are lessons in parenting. And in particular, this week's Torah portion highlights not only lessons in parenting, but negative lessons in parenting. One of the great hallmarks of the Torah is that it does not hesitate to point out the flaws and the foibles of our forefathers. And that helps us to understand, to learn, to know how to be a parent or whatever it is. So this week we have the birth of Jacob and Esau. Yaakov and Esau, Jacob and Esau. The children are struggling around in her belly, and Rivka doesn't know why, and she goes to find out, and she finds out they're going to be different nations, and now they're born. And we're told that as they grew, their parents favored a different child. Listen, Vayav Yitzchak es Esav. Isaac loved Esav. Why? Kitzayid befiv. Literally because game was in his mouth. Which means that he loved the fact that Esau would go out hunting and bring him back game. He'd bring him back from his hunting. V'Rivko havesis Yaakov. Rivka loved Yaakov. Now I want to pay attention here to the fact that Yitzchak's love for Esau is described as being dependent upon something. Whereas Rivka's love for Yaakov is, Rivka loved Yaakov. She loves her children. She loved Yaakov. Yitzchak plays favorites. Yitzchak doesn't only factor, listen, it's my child, I love my child, but Yitzchak favors Esau because of what he does. Because of what he does. We all have this tendency as parents, right? Why can't you be like your sister? Your sister's so good. Oh, I prefer your sister because she brings home the grades, or she brings home the money, or whatever it is. Right? Very often we love a child. Why? We start to love a child because of what they accomplished, and for that matter, the contrast to the child who hasn't accomplished. We have a tendency to do that, and it's a flaw in our parenting. We have to have unconditional love for each child, because children figure out very, very quickly why it is that you love somebody more than they do. In the case of Yitzchak here, he's making a mistake. He's making a mistake. He's falling for Esau. And one of the reasons why we have to be wary of falling for that mistake has to do with the reason behind why Yitzchak preferred Esau. Kitzayid befiv. Tzayid befiv, tzad is to hunt. Esau was a hunter. It's not a particularly deep psychological insight. I think it almost begs to be made. Yitzchak loves that Esau goes out, he's assertive, he's the hunter, he's the... Why? Perhaps because Yitzchak, traumatized at an earlier age at the Akedah, at the binding of Isaac, was passive. He was passive in life. He allowed himself to be bound to the altar. He was passive. So he favors the child who displays the technique that he himself might dislike in himself. Right? Yitzchak's like, I'm passive, and I had to submit, etc., etc. But Esau, he takes his destiny into his own hands. He's not letting anyone tell him what to do. He's out there hunting and making a way for himself in the world. Whereas Yaakov is sitting in a tent somewhere. He's doing tent things. Whatever those things are is described earlier in the Torah portion. And very often we love our children, and we start to favor one child over the other because we're vicariously living through our children. This is always a tremendous mistake, especially because as much as we might be vicariously living through them, they are living their own experience. And they figure out after a while that you're sort of living through them. And it's not healthy for the individual, and it's not healthy for the child. We can't live vicariously through our children. Shep nachas, kvel, kvel. But don't live vicariously through them. Don't let We have to avoid letting our children become the ones who are fixing our own mistakes. We have to fix our own mistakes and our own flaws. I want to share with you finally, and I'm sure I've shared this with you before, but I want to mention it again. The critique of Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch here is also very important. Two kids grow up in the same home, and you almost want to say, how's that possible? They're so totally different. You couldn't have two more different kids than Esav and Yaakov, and their destinies prove out how different that they were. So Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch asks, how is it possible that in one noble household of Rivka and Yitzchak, how is it possible they produce so two radically different children? And Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch says that their mistake in raising their children was that they raised them both the same way. Even though Yaakov was an Ishtam Yoshev Oholim, Yaakov was bookish, and Esav wanted to be out there, right? He's Tzayid Befiv, he wants to be out there, he wants to be active in doing. They raised them both the same way. And that, says Rav Hirsch, is always an educational mistake. We can't raise two children the same way. Every child is different. And one of the most important lessons that the Torah has to teach us here about parenting is we have to treat each individual child in their own way. We have to educate them according to their own way. There's no one way to educate all the children. There's no one way to raise all the children. There's no one way to stimulate and to support children. Every child is different. And every child has to be allowed to and encouraged to excel in their area, in their particular thing, even if it's different than the other kids in the house. These are all lessons that we derive from the Torah, lessons about parenting that we derive from the Torah. The Torah is not here just to teach us mitzvos. It's not here to tell us what to do, and it's not here only to place obligations upon us. All of those things have a goal, and that is that we should live our lives the way that God wants us to live our lives in the best way, and to raise our children and our families in a healthy way. And if that means that our heroes have a little bit of clay feet, that's a good thing. Because the reality is that we all have clay feet, if you will. We're all human beings. We're all flawed. And our goal is not to be perfect. Our goal is to find the heroic within our parenting, the heroic within our grandparenting, to go above and beyond just what we feel and what our impulses are, to love and to shower them with love, and all of that is well and good, but to go beyond that, to treat each child differently, to be certain that our love for one child is not due to somehow living vicariously through them, and to be certain that as we raise our children and our grandchildren, that we instill in them a love of Judaism, which says to them, you can find your own path, but make sure that path is within Torah and Judaism. Shabbat Shalom.